Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writers Drinking Coffee. This is a podcast based on writers sitting around, drinking coffee or red coffee, and talking about writing, publishing, the whole creative process. We do not censor ourselves, but we don't swear a lot either, so please consider us PG-13. Your hosts today are Karen and Chaz Brenchley and myself, John Schmidt. We're talking with Jennifer Nestojko. This is episode 146, interview with Jennifer Nestojko. Well, welcome and hello, Jennifer.
Well, hello. Glad to be here.
And we're glad to have you here. I wanted to have you on the show for three reasons. First of all, you've got some new stories coming out, which I find exciting. Second of all, I wanted to explore with you a little bit about your teaching of writing and a little bit about some of the disability writing you've been doing. So let's start with the happy news, and I'd like happy news from everyone. What have you got coming out?
Well, right now, hopefully by the end of the month or the beginning of next month, there's going to be an anthology in the Midnight Bites series that's put out by Crone Girls Press. It's called Objectified. And so I have this novelette, and it should be coming out, as I said, near the end of the month, beginning of next month. And at the beginning of this month, there was a piece of flash fiction that features Ents in the Santa Cruz Mountains that was put out in Non-Binary Review number 27, which is put out by Zoetic Press. And then in December, I have a story that is making its appearance in the Lesbian Historic Motif Project. So, and that will also be recorded as a podcast recording as well as print. So, and that's available online. So that those three are very exciting things. That's what's coming out currently for me.
Did the novelette is in an anthology of three? Is there a theme to the anthology?
Yes, it's haunted objects. So Crone Girls Press publishes either dark fantasy and or horror anthologies. And so I've actually been published in two of those anthologies so far. And then this one, and those are anthologies with shorter stories, more writers. And then this one is just the three of us, but it is haunted objects.
Very cool. Have you read the other two?
I haven't yet, and I'm really excited because I know that one of them, just the description of it sounds really intriguing, and it's kind of a horror feminist thing, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I think it's one of those that'll make you cringe and laugh at the same time, which it sounds promising.
Yes, that does sound promising.
Right. And I based mine off of a ring that, it's kind of unfair actually to the actual owner, but it's a ring that my grandmother had from her first fiance, which I found out about just a few years ago, that she actually had a fiance and he died. He was a pilot and he died in a plane crash doing training exercises during World War II. And so that kind of gets incorporated into the story.
Yeah, exactly the same thing happened to my mother's fiance in the war. Yeah.
Yeah, so she used to have nightmares about what it was like for him to die in that crash. And so, but I didn't even know that she had been engaged. It was a week or 2 weeks before their wedding was supposed to happen.
Oh.
And so I created, it's not exactly their story, but I created some of the same, I used the ring as my focus for the inspiration for the haunted object.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's somewhat timely given the war going on.
Yeah.
So maybe by the time this episode airs, it will be over in a good way. So
I'm fond of Ukraine. I haven't been there, but I'm fond of it. Nestojko is a Ukrainian name.
Oh, I hadn't known that.
I didn't know that either.
It's a Yugoslavian spelling of a Ukrainian name, but it is a Ukrainian name.
That's okay. That's okay. What are you working on right now? What's going to be next? You've got these all coming out, so that's like old news now, isn't it? And now what's next? I mean, what's the next?
I have a smattering of things because, I've been catching things like by the tail or the toenail as they try to escape me. I have a long commute, and during my commute, that seems to be the quietest time of my day, and that's when things come to me. And then by the time I get out of the car and go in, even if I've recorded it, on a recorder, it starts to dissipate. And so I've caught a couple things and I'd like to get back to them. But I do have a couple of finished stories that I'd like to find homes for. And one is a story about this couple. One of them, she's a retired dragon fighter and is currently doing an equally scary job, which is teaching high school. And,
Oh,
and she's in the middle of teaching one day, and a dragon shows up with a vendetta, and it's huge and everything. And her girlfriend is a baker. And ultimately, things are resolved by a very quick and clever application of puff pastry. And
Does this have anything to do with either A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking by Ursula Vernon T. Kingfisher, or the Greenwing and Dark novel where Mr. Greenwing kills a dragon during a cake baking competition with his offset spatula and frosting knife?
no, that just must be a zeitgeist, because I haven't read those and didn't even know, actually. I think I've heard the first title, but I haven't read them. But I was having a very frustrating day, because sometimes when I'm really tired or the pain is a lot, and because I have chronic pain and some mobility issues, and in the evening sometimes I can't always get the right words. And this is fun when I have an evening class I'm teaching, because sometimes I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to say. I will tell my boys at times, hey, put your plate in the sink. When it comes out, put your plate in the trash, because I can't retrieve the right word. And I was having one of those evenings where I was really frustrated, and I got this idea and I started writing it, because the ex-dragon fighter has that exact problem. And so, her girlfriend comes home, she starts saying things like cabbages, and the girlfriend, and she points at the bedroom, and the girlfriend's like, okay. And she goes into the bedroom, and there's like little goblins who are burrowing into their bedding and destroying it and sending feathers everywhere. But she can't say goblins, she says cabbages, but the girlfriend's used to it. She texts, because many people have this, they can text and write, they can type words that they need, but they can't say them. The disconnect is somehow verbal. And so that's kind of, out of my frustration of not being able to find the right words one evening, I decided, I got this idea for a story and I wrote it out.
You're writing about aphasia here, which some would consider a disability. My knowledge of you says that you are actually, for want of a better term, out there on the front lines of writing about disabilities. Can you speak about that a little?
Well, I was a couple decades ago. My master's thesis was, my working title for it was Crippled Chicks, but that's what it actually got titled. It's Tales from the Bedside, Women with Disabilities in American Fiction. And what I looked at is how the disabled body, female body, is constructed in fiction, and kind of what that meaning is. And at the time, there was almost no disability studies in literature. And so I had to do some of my own research and do some cross-disciplinary studies with sociology texts. And it turns out that, I really should have worked harder to get that published. And by worked harder, I meant tried to get that published.
Yeah.
Because now there's this whole disability studies that is very active and interesting. And I could have been at the forefront of that. And I do know that at the University of Maine, it's one of the master's theses that gets requested frequently. And so they are very adept at making copies of it. So that was, that was something that was very interesting to me, because it appeared that in most stories, the disabled female body it has more baggage than just that this character has a disability and this is how they act with it. They become symbolic for something else. And I dare say that's the same for male bodies and those that are non-binary. The disability is symbolic of something. Louisa May Alcott, she has Jack and Jill, where Jill becomes disabled and eventually she becomes able-bodied again, but it teaches her how to be an adult. It's kind of her entryway, her lesson for these life lessons that she'll need as a woman. And you have other things. In The Bleeding Heart by Marilyn French, the disabled woman is the typical passive woman that feminism was trying to fight against as an image. And actual women at the time with disabilities were being told, no, we don't want to tell your stories because it's so anti-feminist. You're disabled, you're passive, you're the antithesis of a feminist. And this was being said to actually disabled researchers with disabilities. So it's a very interesting thing. And in my own writing, I try to make it more of a lived experience than a symbolic experience.
When I became disabled, I tried to write a story that had a disabled woman character in it, and I couldn't.
Mhm.
And I think part of that was because I really had a hard time, because I was a second-degree black belt and I was in great shape, and suddenly I was too tired, and I was disabled fairly recently. And so since I have had HSCT therapy and no longer have MS, even though I still have some of the nerve damage left, I actually wrote a character who had MS. And the character told me he had MS.
Right.
And it's a black man. The story is a Bayesian theory of wishes, but it was hard for me, but it was also liberating for me to write about what it felt like and what it felt like to find out about what it was that was bothering me. And by the way, if any of you want to read A Bayesian Theory of Wishes, it is in Parsec magazine, issue number 2, which you can find on the internet.
Yeah, but it's a fabulous story.
Oh, thank you.
I'd like to disagree with you, scholar Jennifer, for a second. I think the combination of disability and female outweighs the disability, because there's a number of disabled male characters who the disability isn't that symbolic of. Without hesitation, I would say Long John Silver.
Yeah.
Or Captain Hook actually goes against my thesis, but I'm
In some ways, so does Long John Silver, because we have the trope of the villain with a disabled body, and that's been a very strong trope for a long time in literature. So it has a little more weight than just, well, Long John Silver's a pirate, so he lost his leg. It's the villain with a disability pattern.
And of course, there's Captain Ahab, and nobody can tell me he's not symbolic.
I thought it was the whale that was symbolic, but we don't know if the whale's disabled or whether it's male or female, really.
Yeah.
I did read the book, but I can't remember those details.
But I do think you're right that in some ways the female body, which is often in literature imaged in ways that is also symbolic and not always true to the lived experience of being female, and then the disabled body, the combination is particularly potent, which is part of why I focused on that.
I'm going to have to withdraw my comment, because it's clear that your scholarship versus my anecdote, your scholarship wins. So
That's what scholarship is for, John.
I know,
That's what
but
anecdotes are for. They are there to be, they are trailed like bait for the academia to leap upon and cry, "Oh no, I know better than." And of course, Jen does.
So speaking of which, tell us about your third publication, or your publication in the one in the lesbian anthology. What's up with that?
So Heather Rose Jones has a blog. It's a fantastic blog called the Lesbian Historic Motif Project. And so it also is a podcast. So she has a blog and she explores some of the scholarship on historical experiences of women in community or women who love women, and some of that exploration. She also has a podcast that she does regularly on the same subject, but on 5th Saturdays of the year, she has a fiction series, and she's been doing this for, I think, 4 or 5 years now. And that's a podcast, and the print transcript is also there. I have a story accepted for this year's fiction series for that.
Congratulations.
It's coming out in December. And I've actually had 2 other stories by her accepted and in previous years used. And they're all a little bit different, because one is a further telling of the side story of Hildeberg in Beowulf. And it's what happens when she comes home and she meets up with her widowed childhood friend, and they rather take up possibly where they left off. And it's that experience. They're both very different women now, and they've been through a lot. And then the second one is a story from a 14th century medieval story about a revenant baker who he dies and they bury him, and he keeps coming back trying to bake bread. And it's his wife and her neighbor, and they they keep trying to fight him off while he's coming back. Because
Do they get a dragon for this purpose?
who needs grave dirt in your bread that your business is? And yeah, one of the characters happens to have a limp and uses a crutch, so she can beat him with that. And then this story that's coming out in December is set in late 19th century Boston, and it's a woman who's a shut-in, and it's done, the letter writing style. It's all letters from her to her dearest friend, who is a famous singer and who is traveling. And she's a shut-in and she doesn't travel and she can't go and see her perform. And it's her letters to her. So it's all told through that. So it should be that should lend itself nicely to being read for a podcast. And, it's a fun voice to have embodied for a while.
Nice. But her friend never writes back?
Well, we don't get those, but there are the clues that she has written back.
Okay.
Because it's mentioned in the letter. Oh, thank you so much for this, or I hear about this. So, but I wanted to keep the single voice throughout. Kind of like Daddy Longlegs. If you've ever read Daddy Longlegs, it's from the 19-teens, and it's a delightful story of an orphan girl who gets sent to college by a sponsor.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Okay, I don't know this at all.
Yeah, it's one of the books I inherited from my grandmother. It has a delightful little bit where she's writing, because she has to write to her sponsor, but she doesn't know him. And she calls him Daddy Longlegs because she knows he's tall. And she's got a little bit of a sense of humor. But at one point, she and her friends go out for lunch and they get lobster and buckwheat pancakes for lunch. And it was 35 cents. Cheap. And I'm like, dear God.
The apprentices in Newcastle used to riot because they were being fed too much salmon.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And of course the classic beef and oyster pie is stuffed with oysters because oysters were poor man's food.
Right.
They were available cheap. Beef was expensive.
There was a law in Maine at one point at the turn of, in the 19th century that you could not feed lobster to prisoners 7 times a week. That you had.
I hope not, good Lord.
Pirates to lobsters to, we've certainly exercised the peg leg. I'd like to focus on another aspect of your process, which is, can you just discuss a little, how does the teaching you do affect the writing you do? Do you find yourself having more structured writing? Does it, how does it affect that?
Well, I have taught creative writing, and I am also a composition instructor at San Jose City College. And so I actually teach high school students in the middle college program at San Jose City College, and I teach college classes, college composition classes. So I have a good idea of, structure. And I think revision is one of the biggest things that is important in the whole process. And so I make use of that. My process, where teaching often comes in my process, is if I have a whole bunch of essays to grade, sometimes I write a story instead. Because
it was always the rumor that Tolkien started The Hobbit because he was grading examinations, and he came across that blessed thing to any examiner, which is a blank sheet of paper, and he wrote on it, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," and so on. I get no idea if it's true. I didn't ask him.
I can believe it. I can absolutely believe it, because the first story got published, I was sitting there going, I've been told by Karen, actually, that I should try for this anthology. And I had an idea kind of form and blossom. And I was sitting in my classroom and I had papers to grade and I wrote a story.
Yay.
And then later I edited it and worked with it and sent it in, whereupon it got rejected from the anthology and it got rejected from a couple other things. And I wrote in and said, would it fit to one magazine, online magazine, would it fit with next month's theme better? Because they had a theme every month, and they'd said, look, it doesn't quite fit our theme. And they said, we're so glad you asked. Yes, it would. And I published it. So, and it's out there online. So, and that is the one story of mine that is very specifically about disability. That one really explore some of those ideas. But I had papers to grade, so I wrote a story.
Yes. Yeah, no, I can totally sympathize.
It's like having homework to do.
Mhm.
Same thing. It's like, oh, I must write a story because I have all of this homework, which involves writing to do. So
Right?
yeah.
So I'll do a different kind. And I did
Exactly.
get my papers graded. But sometimes I get inspired by that. I have to grade essays.
Okay. So how do you juggle a career in teaching, particularly, which, famously overruns into your evenings and weekends, plus busy and I suspect rather noisy family, plus being a writer? Where do you fit the writing in?
Nooks and crevices and wherever I could find it. And sometimes I just take a sledgehammer and open up some of those crevices and little nooks in the
Are there any
boulders of
holes in
my
the
day.
ground? In a hole in the ground, wrote Jennifer.
Jennifer found a hole in the ground, tried to squeeze into it. And yeah, I hook in my cane to the hole in the ground and pull out the strange looking snake that lives there and then try to convince it to become my story. That's what I do. Maybe
There
I
you
get
go.
swallowed by the snake, or maybe I swallow the snake and it comes out from one end or another into a
Ew.
story.
Come on, PG-13 here.
My writing process is sometimes filled with strange metaphors because I wrote a poem once on how I shed stories like a virus, like a disease, like dead
Good.
skin.
Oh,
Like
I
a
walk
snake.
around and shed poetry, and everyone, needs to get out of
Yeah.
here else.
Yeah, we haven't talked about your poetry yet. Tell us about your poetry.
I write some. It's
Yes.
cool.
you write
Tell
them
us a little more about your poetry.
a little bit more. What do you write them about, and who do you perform them for?
So I have written a great deal of poetry that I've performed through my hobby in the Society of Creative Anachronism. And so I've written quite a few poems that are in a medieval format, the rhyme royal, triolets, all of that. Sonnets. I finally learned how to do a sonnet, and it took me years to figure it out. I don't naturally, when I read sonnets, they're not always done well because it seems that I have an affinity for Anglo-Saxon style alliterative poetry.
Mhm.
It often starts with a stress at the beginning,
Yeah.
which a
Yes.
sonnet does not. And so once I figured out how to do like pickup words at the beginning of a sonnet, now I can write a sonnet quite nicely. But it was terrible for the longest time, how Brown found her iambic pentameter groove. I do write Anglo-Saxon style poetry, and sometimes in badly translated Anglo-Saxon, because it's been a while since those classes, so I know my grammar is really bad, but I do it. And I once, actually, at one point, I think I had papers to grade. I translated the beginning of modern English's "I'll stop the world and melt with you" into Anglo-Saxon.
That is
Because I
awesome.
figured
Also,
out-
I see a recurring theme here about you having papers to grade.
I have some to grade right now, but I thought it would be fun to turn modern English into Old English.
I like that. I also like the idea of your papers degrading too. But you probably do too. So
Yeah, but my process, sometimes, as I said, I have to carve out the time. And sometimes I have to catch things while they're there because they fade. And you can still catch them, you can still write something from them, but they're never, ever what they were originally. And even if I sit down in a moment.
That's universal, surely.
Yeah.
I mean, every writer sits down at the keyboard with this bright, glorious city in their head and write a sort of tumble down shack.
Yep. Children's book or young adult book. It's a novel, but called A Necklace of Fallen Stars by Beth Hill Gardner.
No.
One of my favorite books in the whole wide world, aside from Lord of the Rings. In it, it's a runaway princess. She's had to run away because it's dangerous where she was, and there's a wizard after her, and she's a storyteller. She tells stories, especially in the poorer sections of the city. And so she's on the run, but as her adventures go, she tells stories. And the stories are in the book. So you not only get the story of her, but you get all the stories she tells. And one of them is called The Colors of the Wind. And it is exactly about that, being able to hear the song of the moon and see the colors of the wind and all of this as an artist. And then even if you capture it in a poem or a story, it's never the same. You never fully capture it. And I love that story. That has been one of my signature stories to tell back in college. I would tell it around, the beach fires that we would do. And we even named our house my senior year Colors for Colors of the Wind because
I've got to read that.
Yeah, absolutely. Do the stories engrossed within the novel sort of reflect back on the action of the novel that contains them?
Not completely until the end. I mean, there's a great story about a palindrome, a boy with a name with a palindrome, and a wizard's preying on him because he's got a spell that requires the blood of a palindrome. And but the last one, which is the title story, so A Necklace of Fallen Stars, does actually play into it perfectly. So that ends with that. But it's really kind of a cool book.
It sounds lovely.
She also wrote a book called Murder for Her Majesty, which is about a girl during Queen Elizabeth's time whose father is murdered. And it's a great book. She hides in the local boys' choir at the local cathedral.
So with all these stories, I realize you have so much time, but have you started a novel or considered novels?
I have considered novels. I'm not at that point yet. Previously to the last, I don't know, 5 or 7 years, I can't remember when I first got These Eyes Are Not My Own published, I was mostly writing poetry. And I had written some short stories, but I hadn't really made a stab at that. This person I know, who I'd mentioned before, said, you should do this. A number of stories that haven't gone anywhere yet that I want to find homes for. I've got stories that are halfway in the works, like I have kind of a follow-up to Flannery O'Connor's story that I'm working on from favorite one by her. But, I have these things. And so probably at some point I'll morph into a larger attempt. But between, teaching, I'm working essentially, I'm working a full-time job, the adjunct job. So that's half-time. But my full-time job was another program was added to it this year that was an online school. And I'm one of the accreditation coordinators at San Jose City College, and we are working on our institutional self-evaluation report for accreditation. So I am juggling several things.
Yes.
Just a few.
Plus, I chair a couple committees. I'm on the academic senate. I don't have any sense of volunteerism at all.
No.
Oh, wait, I do.
And then there's that whole hobby thing that you do and all that other stuff. And
hitting people with sticks and running feasts and little things.
Things like that. I'm going to backtrack for just a second to let you know that when I went to look up that book you love, there's a second book in the series that came out in 2015.
There is.
The Feast of the Trickster, Dreamweaver, book number 2. So hopefully that is news to you of joyous kind.
Actually, I have seen that. I thought it was a separate series on her part. I have it downloaded on my Kindle.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, no, it's that book is a great book and I recommend it to anyone. So it's out of print, but you can get it on Kindle. But I have long haunted used bookstores and now online used bookstores because I do that anyway. And every time I find a good copy in good condition, I tend to buy it because I give it away.
Mm.
When I was packing my English library in order to move to California, I was sorting through, 6,000-7,000 books or something. There are books I only have one of, and there are books that I have two of because it's important enough that you have one to keep and one to lend. There are books that I have 3 copies of, which is one to keep and one to lend. But the point of having a separate one to lend is that sometimes the ones you lend don't come back. And so I had a third one.
Yes.
Just on standby. There are some books that just matter that much.
Yes, there are. Maybe someday one of mine will be one of those. But I'd have to write a full, novel first.
That's a lovely thought, but I don't think you have to have a full novel to have something that is that good. Because the book I most often give out is a novelette or a novella or possibly a novelette itsu, The 13 Clocks by James Thurber, which I love the language in so much of. I bought 40 at one point and gave them all away.
Wow.
I once bought a whole bunch of Door in the Wall by Marguerite d'Angely.
I love that one.
And gave that out because there used to be this book wholesaler in San Jose that we would get our books from for the program. And I saw they had it and the price was great. And so I bought it as a 12th night gift for people and just like handed it out to people. And speaking of disability, that has a great representation. So yeah, and I'd love to at some point, when I get to the right point, publish 1 or 2 collections of my short stories. And maybe 1 or 2 of the ones that may not find a good market or home would fit beautifully in a collection.
Yes, it would.
Yes.
I have a friend from the Milford writing retreat, and she sells and resells and just knows how to sell things. And so I will send you the link where she sells things. It might help.
Wonderful. Because, it's fun. I want people to read my stories. And that's one of my challenges. I think that's one of my biggest challenges, because I put it out there and I'm like, you guys need, read this, and I'll put it out on social media or I'll tell my family, and I often hear crickets. And sometimes I find out that people have read my stories, and strangers even, and that's very exciting. With the first story I published, I was looking for it once for the link because I didn't have it handy, and I accidentally came across reviews of my story, and I had no idea that it had been reviewed, and they were positive. And it was very exciting. People had read it
and liked it.
It's
and I'm not surprised they were positive reviews.
I'm fond of that story. It's a good one. But yeah, I think every artist, every writer wants and needs an audience. If you're going to put words and commit them and shape them and form them and finesse them, you were saying something and you want other people to see it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah, which reminds me, Chaz, don't you have a new reprint coming out?
I have a reprint. I love reprint. I'm really interested to see how people react to it 25 years on.
I think they'll love it, but I'm biased. So
yes, you like good books.
Exactly.
Go ahead and put links to the stories and all these wonderful publications, especially Chaz's stories and Chaz's stories, and also the newsletters available, because we want everyone to get this information along with the other things we mentioned on the website, which is, of course, www.writersdrinkingcoffee.com. Thank you, Jennifer, for coming on our show. And we're definitely going to have you back, because you started some fascinating subjects and showed me, at the very least, that you have enough scholarship that I need to listen more to you.
I would love to listen more to you regardless.
Yeah,
this has been so much fun.
You can also find Writers Drinking Coffee on Facebook or Twitter. We answer email. We do respond to tweets. And if you have a question for Jennifer, we're happy to pass it along to her so she can answer it, because we'll be able to find the hole in her schedule where she might actually see it. You have been listening to Writers Drinking Coffee, a labor of love and enthusiasm put together by the hosts. Our main web support magic is by Deirdre Schween, and our sound engineer and backup web spider is David Welsh. Our intro music is Pretty Maid Milking a Cow, and our exit music is Breakfast with a Morning Person, both by Michael Enberg. You can hear more from Michael Enberg on manyhatsmusic.com. Our podcast sponsors today are Armstreet from Ukraine. Please go ahead and look them up either through the link and buy a blanket for a refugee if you get a chance. So, please keep writing whatever you have, and hey, thanks for listening.